Hi, in this video I'm going to be explaining how I created this flower and its petals in CSS and HTML. Let's get started. Okay, let's take a look at the dev tools. Here we have a container that consists of 4 div elements. The container has a display of type grid, which separates each individual div element to its respective row and column. If I was to remove grid template, you would see that by default they would be stacking below one another. If I add it back in, each div element will be added to its respective grid row and column. Now let's take a look at the div elements itself. As we can see visually, the div element shape has been altered. We do this by adding a border radius. Let's see what happens when we remove the border radius from the elements. As you can see, the element reverts to its default state, which in this case would be a square. Let's add it back in, and we see we have our petal shape. As you can see, I have defined a variable for the radius. This variable can then be used later on if needed in another section of the CSS. What we can also notice is the borders adding a little bit of style to the petal. We do this by adding the border dash top and border dash bottom. If I was to remove border top, you would see that the border is removed. Same thing with the bottom. Let's add it back in. This is just a little bit of style to add to the look and feel of the petals. Okay, now let's add in the petals within the center of the div elements. As you can see, the petals have been added to the divs. It is important to note that these petals have not been created with additional divs, but instead we make use of the pseudo selector elements within CSS. Before we get there, let's go back to the div. The position on the div should be set to relative when working with pseudo selectors, and the pseudo selectors should have a position of absolute and contain a content property. If there is no content property, no content will be displayed. Let me just make an example of this. If I click on content and remove it, the content will remove the 2 petals connected to that before element. Okay, let me refresh the page and we have our elements back. Okay, let me select an element. Here we go. As you can see, I make use of the top and left to set the position of the element and make use of transform with the addition of the rotate function to set the degree at which I want the element to face. If I was to remove transform, the element will go back to its default state. If I was to add it back in, it is set at 45 degrees. As you can see, I make use of border radius, border, border top, and border bottom to set the style of the elements. I also make use of z-index to set the position of which the elements will be displayed. If I was to remove this position of z-index 1, the element will be displayed below the class D2. If I was to add it again, the element would be displayed above the class D2. It is important to note that z-index is not recommended to be used, so use it as little as possible, as it may lead to bugs in the future. Now let's move on to the after. The after consists of the same things within the before in this case. One thing to note though is that the z-index is set at 2 so that the yellow petals may appear above the green petals. If I was to remove the z-index, it will place it at the lowest level below the div elements. If I was to add it back in, it will place it at the highest level above the green petals. One thing to note also is if your div elements or pseudo selectors have an index that is greater than your navigation's index, it will appear above your navigation. So ensure that you set your navigation's index above any other index that may be set within your page. For example, If I was to change this to 5 and I open navigation, it will appear above the navigation bar. And that's it for the Flower CSS practice. Thank you.